Judith looked at my hands before she looked at my face, then asked Daniel if he was really planning to marry a waitress. She did it at a long white table where every server acted like breathing too loud might cost them their job. Daniel's father, Robert, sat across from me with his silver watch showing beneath his cuff, and his sister, Claire, smiled into her wine like she had waited all night for somebody to say it. My name is LEAH, and at that moment, I looked exactly like the kind of woman they thought could be pushed out of a room with one sentence. My dress was from clearance. My nails were clean, but plain. A fresh burn mark near my wrist came from the diner grill. Judith tilted her head and said Daniel was sweet, but sweetness could make a young man stupid. Then she touched his arm and said, in front of me, that girls like me were fine for a season, not for a future. Daniel's hand tightened around mine under the table. For 1 second I thought he would stand up, pull me out of that restaurant, and tell them all to go to hell. Instead, he said softly, "Mom, that's enough." It was not enough, not even close. Robert leaned back and asked where my people were from. Not my family, my people. I told him my mother lived near Knoxville now, but my grandmother Ruth still lived in Willow Creek, tucked back in the hills about 3 hours east, where the river split behind the old chapel and the road turned to gravel after the schoolhouse. The change in his face was small, but I saw it. He set his fork down. Claire stopped smiling. Judith looked at Robert before she looked at me again, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with my dress, my job, or whether Daniel loved me. That was the first time I understood. They had not invited me to dinner to meet me. They had invited me to measure me. Daniel and I had been together 15 months by then, and our beginning had not looked like anything his family would have respected. He came into the diner on a wet Tuesday night with a flat tire, a ruined suit jacket, and a face so embarrassed I felt bad for him before I knew his name. He stayed until closing, carried boxes without being asked, and helped jump my car in the rain. That was Daniel. He came from money but never seemed comfortable wearing it. He said his father built commercial properties, nursing homes, storage facilities, and little shopping plazas outside towns people only noticed when they needed gas. Daniel worked for him because, as he put it, family businesses knew how to turn blood into paperwork. I thought that was just a bitter joke. By spring, Daniel knew which booth at the diner had the bad spring, how my mother liked her tea, and why I mailed Ruth money every Friday, even though Ruth always tried to mail it back. One night, after my mother had a dizzy spell, Daniel came over with soup, drugstore flowers, and a cheap nightlight because my hallway bulb kept flickering. He plugged it in, heated the soup, and sat beside me while I cried. That was the night I started imagining a future with him. So when he talked about marriage, I did not laugh because it was ridiculous. I laughed because it scared me how badly I wanted it. We talked about going to Willow Creek together, and he said we should wait until we had a date set, then bring invitations with us. I loved him for saying it. I also knew there were things I had not told him. Ruth had signed papers the previous winter that put the old chapel, the river path, and 43 acres of wooded land into my name through a family trust. It was not glamorous land. It looked like mud, pine needles, a half-rotted bridge, and a chapel so small you could miss it if the weeds were high. But to the right developer, it was a door. The county had been whispering for 2 years about a private retreat, river cabins, wedding barns, and luxury hiking trails. Men had been knocking on Ruth's door with offers that sounded kind until you read the last page. Ruth was old, but she was not slow. She gave the land to me because people underestimate a tired young woman fast, and that makes her dangerous. I had never told Daniel because I did not want land, lawyers, or family greed sitting at our kitchen table before love had a chance to breathe. After that dinner with his family, I started wondering if silence had protected the wrong person. In the parking lot, Daniel apologized before we even reached his car. He said Judith was cruel when she felt scared, Robert hated losing control, and Claire treated every woman near Daniel like a thief reaching for the silver. I asked him what Willow Creek meant to his father. He looked at me too quickly. Then he said, "Nothing." Why? That one word, nothing, did not sound empty. It sounded locked. 2 days later, he left his phone on my kitchen counter while he went downstairs to get the laundry. It lit up with Robert's name. I was not the kind of woman who went through a man's phone, but the message showed on the screen without me touching it. Do not let her talk to Ruth before Labor Day. We need the access issue handled first. My whole body went cold. When Daniel came back upstairs, he saw my face before he saw the phone. I asked what access issue meant. He picked up the phone, read the message, and closed his eyes in a way that made my stomach drop. He said it was not what I thought. That sentence has ruined more women than the truth ever could. I told him to explain it, right there, without touching me or making me feel guilty for asking. He sat at my little kitchen table, still holding our warm laundry, and said Robert had been looking at land around Willow Creek for a project. He said he had not known Ruth was my grandmother when the first file crossed his desk, and he had told Robert to back off. I asked why Robert knew we were going there for Labor Day. Daniel swallowed. He said he had mentioned it months earlier, before he understood the land fight. He said his father probably thought Daniel could make the family seem less threatening. Less threatening. That was such a careful phrase, and careful phrases always hide a mess. I asked him if he had seen the papers. He said yes. I asked if he knew the chapel and River Path were in a trust. His face changed again. Softer this time, almost wounded, and he said he suspected something like that, but did not know for sure. I did not tell him I was the trustee. Not yet. He reached across the table, stopped himself halfway and said, "Leah, I love you. I did not bring you into this. I swear to you, I have been trying to keep them away from you." I wanted to believe him, because every good thing in my life had Daniel's voice attached to it by then. The soup, the rain, the hallway light, his hand at the small of my back when my mother walked too slowly down clinic steps, his laugh when Ruth mailed him blackberry jam with a warning. Love makes evidence feel rude. I told him we were still going to Willow Creek. My mother Ellen had already packed enough snacks for a minor evacuation, and Ruth had been calling every night to ask what Daniel liked to eat. Daniel said he wanted to go. He said he wanted to look Ruth in the eye and promise his father's business would never touch her land. The next morning, Robert called me at the diner. Nobody at that number should have been able to reach me except family, my manager, and Daniel. When I picked up, Robert said my name like he owned the shape of it. He told me Daniel was confused. He told me young men sometimes mistook rescue for love. He said poor women with sick mothers and elderly grandmothers often grabbed the first ladder they saw, and he did not blame me for that. But he did expect me to be dignified. I stood behind the pie case with a coffee pot in my hand, listening to a man worth millions explain dignity to a woman he thought could not afford a lawyer. Then he offered me $15,000 to end the relationship before the weekend. He said it like he was being generous. I asked him if Judith knew he was trying to buy his son's life in cash. He paused, then said I had more attitude than leverage. That was his mistake. I hung up, walked into the back office, and called Adam, the attorney who had handled Ruth's trust. I asked for every document connected to the Willow Creek property, every inquiry from Harbor Stone, and every county note. By closing time, my inbox had more truth in it than Daniel had given me in 15 months. Harbor Stone had tried 3 times to secure access across Ruth's land. The last letter mentioned a chapel easement and an unnamed family connection who might help resolve resistance after Labor Day. Daniel's name was not on the letter. Robert's was, but Daniel's initials were in the corner of one internal map. I printed it and stared until the letters blurred. When Daniel picked me up that night, I did not confront him. I climbed into the car, kissed him once because I still loved him, then folded the map into my purse and said we should leave early in the morning. He smiled with relief, and that hurt more than anger would have. We drove east before sunrise with Ellen asleep in the back seat under a travel blanket and a bag of boiled eggs at her feet. Daniel kept one hand on the wheel and one hand near mine, not pushing, just waiting. Outside Knoxville, he said he had told Robert not to call either of us again. I asked if Robert listened when Daniel told him no. Daniel looked at the road and said, "He listens when no costs him something." That answer stayed with me. Willow Creek looked smaller than I remembered and sharper than I was ready for. The grocery had a new metal roof. Ruth's porch still leaned left, and the creek behind her house made the same low running sound from my childhood. Ruth hugged Daniel first, which surprised him. She was 5 feet tall, 81 years old, and still capable of making grown men stand straighter. She held his face in both hands and said he had kind eyes, but kind eyes did not excuse weak decisions. Daniel laughed nervously. Ruth did not. That afternoon should have been peaceful. Ellen helped in the kitchen. Daniel fixed a loose porch rail without being asked. Ruth made coffee strong enough to keep a corpse awake. Cousins and neighbors came by, and for a few hours Daniel was easy again. The man I knew before files, calls, and careful phrases. Then Mason walked up the porch steps. He was local in the way men become local when they never leave and make everyone else pay for it. He wore a clean shirt, polished boots, and a smile that looked practiced in bathroom mirrors. Ruth's hand tightened around her coffee cup when she saw him. Mason said he heard the city granddaughter was back with her rich boyfriend. The porch went quiet. Daniel stood, polite but stiff. Mason looked him over and said Robert had described him as more cooperative. Daniel's face drained of color so quickly even Ellen noticed. I asked Mason why he was on my grandmother's porch. He held up a folder and said he was trying to save an old woman from being trapped under land she could not maintain, and a granddaughter too sentimental to understand opportunity. Then he smiled at Daniel and added that some families knew how to turn useless dirt into legacy. It was the same tone Judith had used at dinner. Different mouth. Same contempt. Ruth told him to get off her porch. Mason looked at her, then at me, and said the chapel road would be resolved one way or another, because important people had already made plans. Daniel moved before I did. He stepped off the porch and stood so close to Mason that Mason's smile finally twitched. Daniel told him if he came near Ruth again, Robert would be the least of his problems. For 1 second, I believed him completely. Then Mason laughed and said, "You really didn't tell her, did you?" Nobody moved. Mason looked at me with something almost like pity and said I should ask Daniel why his father knew the chapel door had a broken latch. After he left, Daniel swore he had no idea what Mason meant. Ruth said the chapel door did not have a broken latch. She said she had replaced it herself after somebody tried to pry it open in March. I asked who had a key. Ruth said only her, Adam, and the county caretaker before he died. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face and said, "Mason was trying to split us apart." Maybe he was. But a good lie works best when it lands near an ugly truth. That night I found the blue folder in Daniel's duffel. I was putting his clean shirt on the chair beside the bed when the folder slid out from between his jeans. It hit the floor open, scattering 3 pages across Ruth's braided rug. There was a map of the river path, an email chain with Robert's name, and a dark photograph of the chapel interior with a white angel statue circled in red. I heard Daniel step into the doorway behind me. He did not ask what I was doing. He just looked at the papers, then at me, and whispered my name like he already knew something had broken. I asked why he had a photograph from inside a locked chapel. He said Robert sent it to him weeks ago. He said he kept the folder because he was building a case against his father, not helping him. He said Harborstone had been using Mason to pressure Ruth, and he was trying to prove it before Robert could bury everything under new paperwork. I wanted to scream. Instead, I picked up the photograph and pointed to the red circle. Why the angel? Daniel looked at it for too long. Then he said he did not know. It It was the wrong answer, not because it sounded false, but because it sounded afraid. Ruth came to the door before I could say anything else. She saw the photograph in my hand and sat down so fast the old bed frame creaked. Ellen hurried in from the hallway, asking what happened, but Ruth did not answer her. She kept looking at the angel in the picture. Finally, she said that statue had not been inside the chapel since my grandfather died. She said it had been moved to the storage shed behind the schoolhouse 12 years ago because the floor near the altar was weak. She said if that picture was recent, somebody had been inside the chapel, moved the angel back, and taken a photograph after doing it. Daniel turned toward the window. I asked him who would do that. He said quietly, "Somebody who wants Ruth scared enough to sell." That should have been the moment I told him the trust was in my name. I should have told him Robert was not fighting Ruth anymore. He was fighting me. I should have watched Daniel's face and seen whether relief or calculation came first. But Ruth grabbed my wrist, hard, and gave the smallest shake of her head. Not yet. The next morning was Labor Day Saturday, and the whole town seemed determined to pretend nothing ugly had ever happened there. Folding tables lined the church hall. Kids ran with paper flags. Veterans sold raffle tickets. Old men argued about barbecue, as if the fate of the nation depended on sauce. Daniel stayed close to me. Too close. Every time my phone buzzed, he looked at it. Every time Ruth spoke to someone near the county table, Daniel watched. I could not tell if he was protecting me or monitoring damage. Then Judith arrived. She stepped out of a black SUV in cream pants and sunglasses, looking so out of place near the gravel lot that even the children slowed down to stare. Robert was not with her, but Claire was, and Mason walked beside them like a man escorting money. Daniel went still. Judith crossed the grass without greeting anyone, and stopped in front of Ruth's pie table. She looked at my grandmother's hands, bent with age, then at the old chapel visible beyond the trees. She told Ruth it was cruel to let sentiment stand in the way of progress. Ruth smiled. It was not a warm smile. Judith said families like ours always called it heritage, when what we really meant was poverty with better lighting. Claire laughed under her breath. Mason pretended to check his phone, but he was enjoying it. People heard. That was the point. Daniel told his mother to leave. Judith ignored him and looked straight at me. She said I had done well for myself, getting Daniel emotionally tangled before anyone explained what people like us cost men like him. That sentence landed in front of half the town. I felt every eye turn toward me. The girl who left, the waitress, the granddaughter with the sick mother, the woman standing beside a man whose family had arrived in a black SUV to discuss progress. Judith stepped closer and said, "Let him go, Leah. You cannot build a marriage on a porch, a dying chapel, and whatever little pride your grandmother signed over to you." There it was. She knew something had been signed over. Not enough, but something. Daniel's face changed when he heard it. He looked at Judith, then at me, and the hurt in his eyes was real enough to confuse me. He had not known. Or he had not known all of it. Ruth picked up one of her pies and placed it calmly in Ellen's hands. Then she told Judith that some women spent so much time decorating their cruelty, they forgot it still smelled rotten. A few people gasped. Somebody laughed once, then stopped. Judith's cheeks flushed. Mason stepped in, smiling, and said this was exactly why outside stewardship was needed. He said emotions made landowners irrational. He said the chapel could become something beautiful if people with vision took control. Daniel said, "Nobody is taking control." Mason looked at him and said, "Your father already has." That was the second time the day split open. Before Daniel could answer, his phone rang. Robert's name lit the screen. Daniel stared at it, then answered, and walked away toward the road. I followed far enough to hear Daniel say, "You promised me you would not come here." Then he listened. Whatever Robert said made Daniel turn and look at the chapel. Not at me, not at Ruth, at the chapel. When he came back, he looked almost sick. He said he needed air and asked if we could go to the falls. Just the two of us, away from everybody. I should have said no. I should have stayed with Ruth, called Adam, opened every document, and dragged the whole mess into daylight. But Daniel looked like a man carrying a confession in his mouth and choking on it. So I went. We took Ruth's old road past the schoolhouse and left the car where the gravel washed out. The sky had been uneasy all afternoon, low clouds pressing against the ridge, but the trail smelled like wet leaves and riverstone. Daniel held my hand when we crossed the narrow plank bridge. At the river, he took off his shoes, rolled up his pants, and stepped into the cold water like a boy daring himself to be happy. I loved him so much in that moment. I hated him for it. He came back to the bank, took my face in his hands, and said he was sorry. Not the quick kind people use to end a fight. A torn open sorry. He said Robert had built his life taking small things from people who could not afford to fight long enough to keep them. He said he had spent years calling himself different because he hated it quietly. Then he said quiet hatred was still obedience. I asked him what Robert had on the chapel. Daniel looked toward the trees. He said, "I think he staged something in there." Thunder moved over the ridge before I could ask what that meant. Rain came hard and sudden, turning dust to slick clay in seconds. We ran back through the pasture, but the trail darkened fast. By the time we reached the old chapel, water was pouring from the roof in sheets, and the schoolhouse was too far ahead. Daniel pointed to the chapel and said we should wait inside. I told him no. Ruth said the latch had been replaced. If the door was open, something was wrong. He tried the handle anyway. The door opened with one push. Daniel looked back at me, rain running down his face. Neither of us spoke. Inside, the chapel smelled like dust, old wood, and wet leaves. It was darker than I remembered, with the narrow windows boarded from outside and the pews lined in crooked rows. Rain hammered the roof until the whole building seemed to breathe around us. Daniel shut the door most of the way but did not latch it. He kept staring toward the altar. I asked what he had meant by staged. He said Robert had once paid people to make a holdout owner believe a property was unsafe. Broken pipes, missing documents, threats no one could prove. If Ruth thought the chapel had been vandalized, Robert could push the county to condemn the access road and force a legal fight. I asked why the angel mattered. Daniel did not answer. Lightning flashed, and for one white second, I saw it. The angel statue stood near the left wall, taller than I remembered, its face tilted down, one stone hand lifted. It should not have been there. It should not have been anywhere near that chapel. Daniel grabbed my arm. His fingers dug in so hard I almost cried out. I told him he was hurting me. He did not seem to hear. He was staring past the angel now, past the wall, past everything ordinary. Then another flash of lightning ripped through the boards over the windows. Daniel's face changed into something I had never seen on a living person. Not surprise. Terror. He whispered, "Leah, run." Before I could move, he shoved me behind him so hard my shoulder hit a pew. The thunder cracked above us. Daniel stumbled backward, knocking one bench sideways, his eyes locked on the shadow behind the angel. And in that last burst of light before the chapel went black again, I saw what he had seen. The angel was not alone. The thing behind the angel moved. At first, my mind refused to make it human. It was just a tall white shape pressed into the dark, half hidden by the statue, its face too pale, its shoulders too still, one hand raised near the wall like it had been waiting for us to notice. Then the flashlight clicked on beneath its chin. Daniel made a sound I had never heard from him before. Not a scream exactly. More like his breath had been torn out of him. He shoved me again, harder this time, and I fell between two pews with my hip striking the floor. The light swung toward me. That was when I saw the boots. No ghost wears work boots with orange clay stuck to the heels. Daniel saw them too. I watched the terror in his face turn into recognition, then rage. He lunged toward the figure, but the person jerked backward, knocking the angel statue sideways. Stone scraped wood. Thunder cracked above us, and the whole chapel seemed to come apart in noise. Daniel yelled Mason's name. The figure ran. For one wild second, I thought Daniel would catch him. He went after him through the center aisle, hitting a pew with his thigh, then another with his shoulder. I screamed for him to stop because the floor near the altar was weak, because Ruth had said it 100 times when I was a child, because some dangers live in your memory even when you forget why. Daniel did not stop. The boards gave way under him near the left side of the altar. His body dropped hard, not all the way through, but enough for one leg to vanish into the broken floor. The sound he made after that was worse than the first one. Mason disappeared through the side door, leaving the flashlight spinning on the floor, and its beam rolled across Daniel's face. He was awake. That almost made it worse. He looked at me and said my name, but it came out thin and wet with pain. I crawled to him, my hands sliding on dust and rainwater, and tried to pull the broken boards away from his leg. He grabbed my wrist and told me to leave. I said no. He said, "Leah, he has a camera." That did not make sense to me until I saw the little black device clipped to the front pew, aimed toward the place where the angel stood. Not at the door, not at the aisle, at me. That was the real trap. I stopped breathing for half a second. They had not wanted to frighten Ruth with a ghost story. They had wanted a recording. Me inside the chapel. Me reacting. Me looking unstable, trespassing, maybe fighting with Daniel if they pushed it hard enough. A broken chapel. A staged figure. Daniel's panic. My screams. All of it could be cut into whatever lie Robert needed. They were not just trying to take land. They were trying to create the reason. Daniel's fingers tightened around my wrist. He said his father would use anything. Then his eyes shifted toward the door, and I knew he was trying to tell me Mason might come back. I pulled my phone from my pocket with shaking hands. The screen was cracked from the fall, but it still worked. I called 911, then Ruth, then Adam. I do not remember what I said to the dispatcher. I remember saying chapel, Daniel, blood, please hurry, over and over until the words stopped sounding like language. Daniel's breathing changed while I was on the phone. It went from fast to uneven, then too quiet. I pressed my hand to his chest and told him to stay with me. His eyes opened, and for one moment he looked almost calm. He whispered that he had tried to fix it. I told him he still could. He said, "I already sent it." Then his hand slipped off my wrist. The rain softened outside as if the weather had finished doing what it came to do. I screamed until my throat burned. I pressed both hands to his chest the way the dispatcher told me. I counted, messed up, counted again, and begged a man who had carried soup into my apartment to keep breathing on a chapel floor his father had turned into a weapon. By the time Ruth's neighbor Henry came running in with his son Caleb, I was covered in dust, rain, and blood from my own scraped hands. Henry took over compressions. Caleb stood by the door with a hunting flashlight, pale and shaking, watching the woods like the devil himself might step out. When the paramedics arrived, they worked on Daniel in the aisle. When they carried him out, I followed with one shoe missing, and Daniel's phone clutched in my hand because he had pushed it toward me before his fingers went loose. I did not understand why then. I understood later. At the hospital, Robert arrived before the doctor came out. That told me more than any confession could have. He came through the emergency entrance in a dark raincoat with Judith behind him, dry under a black umbrella someone else had held. Claire was there too, her eyes red, but her mouth already tight with accusation. Robert looked at me once, from my muddy dress to my bare foot, then walked past me like grief had a dress code and I had failed it. Judith saw Daniel's blood on my sleeve and made a sound like I had brought dirt into her house. She asked what I had done. Ellen stepped between us so fast her shoulder hit mine. Ruth came in behind her, leaning on Henry's arm, her face gray but her eyes sharp. Judith looked at my grandmother and said this was what happened when desperate families dragged decent sons into old property fights. Every person in that waiting room heard it. I did not answer. I was still holding Daniel's phone. My thumb kept touching the locked screen, and every time it lit up, I saw one unread message from Robert. You get her inside, then leave Mason to handle the rest. It had come 15 minutes before Daniel and I reached the chapel. My grief changed shape. The doctor came out at 7:42 p.m. I remember the clock because I stared at it while he spoke. Daniel had gone into cardiac arrest. They had tried everything. The fall, the shock, the stress, maybe an underlying condition nobody knew about. All of it had been too much. Judith collapsed into Claire's arms. Robert did not. He closed his eyes for 1 second, then opened them and looked straight at me. Not broken, not lost, calculating. He told the sheriff's deputy standing near the nurse's desk that he wanted me questioned immediately. He said I had lured Daniel onto restricted property, that my family had a history of disputes over that land, and that Daniel had been trying to break things off with me because he finally realized I was using him. That was when I found my voice. I told the deputy to take Daniel's phone. Robert's face tightened. I handed it over before anyone could stop me. Then I gave them mine, too. The cracked screen was still recording. I had started a voice memo after Daniel said Robert staged something in the chapel, before the rain pushed us inside. I had forgotten it was running. Robert saw the red recording line before the deputy locked the phone in an evidence bag. For the first time, he looked afraid. Fear looks different on rich men who think the world comes with a receipt. It does not make them small right away. First, it makes them angry. He said the recording was inadmissible. He said I had no right to Daniel's phone. He said I was contaminating evidence. Judith raised her head and called me a little thief in front of the deputy, nurses, my mother, my grandmother, and 2 families waiting for news about people they loved. Ruth stepped forward then. She said, "Robert, you always did talk too much when you were cornered." He looked at her like he had forgotten old women could remember things. Ruth told the deputy that Robert had been trying to force access across her family property for months. Then she looked at me and nodded once. Not yet had ended. I opened my purse, pulled out the folded copy Adam had given me, and placed it on the plastic waiting room table between coffee cups and a box of tissues. I told Robert the chapel land was not Ruth's to sell. Judith wiped her face and snapped that everybody knew it belonged to Ruth. I said, "No, it belongs to me." Silence moved through that waiting room so fast, even the vending machine hum seemed loud. Robert stared at the paper. He understood before Judith did. Men like him always recognize control when it changes hands. I told him I was the trustee and legal owner of the chapel parcel, the river path, and the access strip Harborstone needed. I told him every offer, every pressure letter, every visit from Mason, and every stage scare had been aimed at the wrong woman. Claire whispered, "Daniel knew?" I looked at her, and for the first time that night, she could not hold my eyes. I said Daniel knew enough to be ashamed of his father. Robert moved toward the table, but the deputy blocked him. That small movement changed the room more than any speech could have. Robert was used to people stepping aside. The deputy did not. Then Adam walked in. He was still wearing jeans and a rain jacket, hair flattened to his forehead, leather folder tucked under one arm. He had driven from the county courthouse annex after getting my call. He did not waste time comforting anybody. Some people are useful because they understand when tenderness has to wait. He handed the deputy a packet and said there was an active civil file involving repeated coercive acquisition attempts by Harborstone, including suspected trespass, fraudulent easement pressure, and witness intimidation. He also said Daniel had sent him a secure file at 5:18 that afternoon. Robert said, "That is impossible." Adam looked at him and said, "It was scheduled delivery." That was when Daniel's last words came back to me. "I already sent it." The file Daniel sent had emails, maps, Mason's invoices, photographs of the chapel interior, and an audio clip of Robert telling Daniel that poor families only protected land because nobody had taught them the right number. It also included one message Daniel had written to Adam that afternoon, after the festival and before the river. "If anything happens today, my father is using Mason to stage an incident at the chapel. Leah does not know the whole truth. That is my fault. Protect her first." I read those lines 2 hours after Daniel died, sitting in a sheriff's office with a blanket around my shoulders and dried mud on my legs. That was the first time I cried without sound. The sheriff did not arrest Robert that night. People think truth moves fast once it appears. It does not. Truth has to be labeled, logged, copied, authenticated, and handed to people who still ask whether the powerful person might have an explanation. But they did arrest Mason before sunrise. Caleb had seen him come out of the woods behind the chapel and run toward the maintenance road. Henry knew the truck. Everyone in Willow Creek knew every truck. The deputies found Mason at his cousin's garage, trying to wash clay off his boots and delete footage from a camera card. He said it was a prank. That word almost made me hit him. A prank does not require forged maintenance notices. A prank does not require moving an angel statue from a schoolhouse shed. A prank does not require a camera aimed at a woman whose property you want. A prank does not end with a man dead on a chapel floor while his father waits at the hospital ready to blame the woman holding his phone. By Sunday afternoon, the story had already split in two. In Robert's version, Daniel had died because he got tangled in my family's irrational land obsession. In Willow Creek's version, a rich developer had tried to scare an old woman and killed his own son with the weight of his greed. The second version traveled faster. Judith called me once. I answered because grief makes you do strange things, and I thought maybe she had found one human sentence inside herself. She did not. She told me if I released anything publicly, she would make sure every newspaper in the state knew I was the waitress who trapped Daniel, hid property from him, and stood to profit from his death. She said men like Daniel did not choose women like me unless they had been emotionally manipulated. I let her talk. Then I told her the call was being recorded. She went quiet so fast I heard Claire crying in the background. That was the moment I stopped defending myself. On Monday, Robert filed an emergency petition through an attorney I had seen at his dinner table. He claimed the chapel parcel had become a public safety hazard and asked the county to restrict access pending a development review. If he could not own the land, he wanted to choke it through bureaucracy until I had no money left to fight. Adam smiled when he read it. That scared me more than if he had cursed. He told me Robert was desperate because Harborstone's financing depended on clean access by the end of the quarter. Without it, 2 lenders could pull back. Without the lenders, Robert's board would start asking why he had risked millions on a parcel controlled by a waitress he had personally harassed. The hearing was set for Wednesday morning in the county administration building. Daniel had not even been buried yet. I wore the same simple black dress I had planned to wear to his service. I did not wear makeup. I did not fix my hair beyond pulling it back. Robert's attorney arrived with a leather briefcase, polished shoes, and the patient smile of a man who expected poor people to become confused by procedure. Robert sat behind him. Judith sat beside Robert in pearls. Mason was not there. He was in county custody, suddenly much less brave without a costume, a flashlight, and a rich man behind him. The room was not full, but it felt full. Ruth sat on my left. Ellen sat on my right. Henry and Caleb sat behind us. So did 3 people from the festival, the schoolhouse caretaker's widow, and a reporter from the Knoxville paper who had somehow heard enough to drive in. Robert saw the reporter and leaned toward his attorney. Good. Let him feel watched. The county judge began with safety. Robert's attorney talked about the chapel floor, unstable access, public risk, and the need for responsible stewardship. He used that phrase twice. Responsible stewardship. It sounded clean until you knew what it was covering. Then he looked at me and said, with sympathy so false it insulted the room, that grief could cloud judgment. He said I was young, emotionally compromised, and under the influence of older relatives who had filled my head with fear of development. He said nobody was accusing me of wrongdoing, which is the kind of sentence people use right before they accuse you without courage. Then Robert asked to speak. His attorney tried to stop him. Robert stood anyway. He looked right at me and said Daniel would still be alive if I had not dragged him into that chapel. The room went completely still. There are sentences that do not just hurt. They remove the last gentle thing inside you. I stood up before Adam touched my arm. The judge told me to sit, but I asked for permission to respond, because Robert had made a direct factual accusation. My voice shook at first. Then I looked at Ruth's hands folded over her cane, and it steadied. I said Daniel went into that chapel because Robert sent him a message telling him to get me inside. Robert laughed once and said that was a disgusting lie. Adam handed the judge the phone extraction report. The judge read for longer than Robert expected. Then he looked up and asked Robert if the message was his. Robert's attorney stood so quickly his chair scraped the floor. Robert said nothing. That silence did what my anger could not. Adam played the chapel recording next. Not all of it. Just enough. Daniel's voice saying Robert had staged something. My voice asking why the angel mattered. The door opening. The flashlight. Daniel yelling Mason's name. The crash. My 911 call starting while I screamed that Daniel was trapped. Judith covered her mouth. Claire was not there to smile anymore. Then Adam played the clip Daniel had sent him, Robert's own voice, recorded days earlier. Poor families only protect land because nobody has taught them the right number. Make the girl look unstable. Make the old woman beg for outside help. Once the county touches it, we control the timeline. Nobody breathed normally after that. The judge denied the petition before Robert's attorney finished objecting. He referred the materials to the sheriff and the district attorney. He ordered no contact between Harborstone representatives and me, Ruth, Ellen, or the property. He also barred any company agent from entering the chapel land pending investigation. Robert stood there as if the floor had shifted under him. I wanted satisfaction to feel clean. It did not. Daniel was still dead. Judith was still crying into a handkerchief she probably thought cost more than my shoes. Robert was still breathing after teaching his son that love could be managed like a contract. But power had changed sides. Outside the building, the reporter asked Robert whether Harborstone had staged intimidation tactics against a local landowner. Robert pushed past him. Judith followed, but she stopped near me, her face swollen, her pearls crooked. For 1 second, I thought grief had humbled her. Then she said Daniel had ruined himself for me. I looked at her and said, "No, Judith. Daniel died trying to undo what Robert taught him." She slapped me. The sound cracked across the steps in front of the reporter, the deputy, half the hearing room, and Robert's own attorney. Judith realized what she had done 1 second too late. Ruth moved faster than anyone expected and put herself between us. She did not raise her voice. She told Judith that if she touched me again, the next person she spoke to would not be family. It would be a judge. The reporter's camera kept clicking. By Friday, Harborstone announced Robert had taken a temporary leave for personal reasons. By the next week, temporary had become indefinite. 2 lenders froze their commitments. Mason's attorney started talking about cooperation. The phrase reckless endangerment became conspiracy. Then conspiracy became criminal solicitation. I learned how slowly consequences move through expensive hallways. But for the first time, they were moving toward the right door. Daniel's funeral was quiet. Judith did not look at me. Claire did once from across the aisle, then lowered her eyes like shame had finally found her. Robert came with 2 attorneys and left before the final prayer. I placed one white rose on Daniel's casket and tucked a folded note beneath it. I did not write a speech. I wrote what I could survive. I told him I knew he tried. Months passed before the chapel was safe to enter again. I used part of the settlement money from the civil case to repair the floor, replace the windows, and build a small path from the schoolhouse with a handrail for Ruth. Harborstone never touched the land. Robert eventually pleaded to reduced charges tied to coercion and evidence tampering. Mason served time. Judith sold the lake house. Claire sent me one letter I never answered. The angel statue went back into the schoolhouse shed. I could not bear to look at it. The first Sunday, the chapel reopened. Ruth sat in the front pew with Ellen beside her. Henry and Caleb came. So did people who had whispered about me at the festival and later brought casseroles because small towns apologize through food before words. I stood near the side wall, close to the place where Daniel had fallen, and listened to the rain begin softly against the new roof. For a moment, I was back there. The dark. The flashlight. His hand on my wrist. His voice telling me he had already sent it. I thought grief would take me under again, but then I looked at the door and saw sunlight coming through the clean glass. They had called me a waitress, a climber, a desperate girl with nothing but an old grandmother and a dying chapel. They had not known the land was mine. They had not known Daniel had chosen the truth before it cost him everything. And they had not known that sometimes the person they think is easiest to break is the one holding the one piece of ground they can never buy. What would you do in this situation? Be honest. Or did this remind you of someone? Tell me in the comments. And if this made you think about your own relationship, I left something in the description that can help you build something stronger. Subscribe if you want more stories like this every day, and share this with someone who needs to hear this story.